Well, hello. It's great to see you here. I'm glad that you're here in Berlin and decided to listen to the two of us while we talk about what we think about at home and what happens within our four walls, especially since we have now two children. But we'll start with what our thoughts were when our first child was born. So it's been 3.5 years now. When he was born, we had done a lot of thinking about how we wanted to raise him, of course. Like, what would that look like? We read many parenting forums and tips and advice from educational experts and tried to figure out which is the best, which is the best wooden toys that we can buy or borrow for our children. Which kindergarten is close to where we live, and ideally one that is also teaching children Mandarin. The main goal is the best thing for the child, so it doesn't miss out on the chance of getting an Oscar or a Nobel Prize as early as possible. And even though we might not know much about these things, but you already heard in the introduction, this child is Jewish, Pakistani, Hessian, German. All of these things were there for the child for children from the very beginning, basically put into the crib with the baby. And so it's almost like an experiment in hybrid identity. And so if the whole Nobel Prize thing doesn't work out, then with our mother tongues, Urdu and Hebrew, at the very least, there could be a career as a Mossad agent could be in the cards. And so the project Muslim Jewish Child has doubled. We have two children now. The youngest is 1, the elder 3 years old. And we hope that both of our children feel at home in both religions, so in Islam and as a Jew, but also in all three cultures, so Pakistani, Israeli, and German, and feel at home in all three. But we have to say that this experiment ran into its first issues just after birth, because when we applied for a birth certificate at the German agency, then they said, well, like having two religions, no, that is not allowed. Bureaucratically on this form. After a quick conversation in the hallway, we suggested, can't we put diverse as a religious affiliation? We were so excited about our idea. It's so progressive. You're already laughing. Then when we went back to the bureaucrat at the agency and explained why this should be the case and got a very definite but friendly no. And so ultimately we had to go with no religious affiliation. But if you ask my parents or Saba's parents, they don't really no religious affiliation. That doesn't mean anything to them. For them, our children are obviously clearly Muslim if you ask her parents, and if you ask my parents, our children are very clearly Jewish. And we also celebrate Chanukka with baklava, or something we haven't tried yet, the dry Mazze bread, which really doesn't taste great. Maybe including that for Eid. We should try that. But we have a really interesting and hybrid, intense Spotify playlist. It has lots of Quran verses that are being cited in Arabic, and then if you click shuffle, you might suddenly hear a Zionist children's song from the 1920s, or other children's songs in Urdu or Hebrew. Yeah, many people think, and something that we also heard in the keynote, we tend to think about identity in terms of either or. So you're Muslim or Jewish, or you're German or a migrant, or you're religious or a doubter or whatever. And for us, we would like to put an "and" there. We're all migrants in some way, but also Germans. We're religious, but also do have our doubts. We're believers and have our doubts at the same time. And we watch Tatort on Sundays at 8:15 p.m., quintessential German crime show. And if the state is already this far and diverse is officially recognized as a gender identity, why can't it be recognized as a religious identity? Because identity comes from many different sources, and we can mix them in a way that works for us. But it's not just the state that doesn't necessarily see it that way. It also includes our religious organizations, especially those that have a more orthodox understanding or interpretation in their practice and interpretation and practice. So in other words, so the Jewish law, halacha, says that being Jewish is something that transmits through the mother. So from that perspective, our two sons are not Jews. In Islam, religion is transferred through the father. So, well, bad luck. In a different mother-father constellation, it might have been a bit easier. Well, maybe it would have been easier, but this basic longing for simplicity and clarity is something that we hear about a lot, not just in the Jewish and Muslim communities, but we also realize that society really struggles with these ambiguities and that people expect us to have clarity. They want to know, what are your sons? Are they Jews? Are they Jewish or are they Muslim? And our answer is, well, they're probably both. They're probably neither. Maybe identity is a space where different kinds of belonging can meet each other that usually are mutually exclusive. For us, identity is not fate, but it's something that we are able to create ourselves in Urdu and Hebrew, with Alugobi and Shakshuka, at the very least with a lot of respect, but also humor. I mean, yeah, that's the theory, but if you look at Jewish and Muslim communities, you might also realize very quickly that, to put it mildly, Jews and Muslims have not been the best of friends historically and definitely not recently. And so when you hear what one community says about the other, then many Jews say, well, Muslims are backwards, they're dangerous, when in doubt, they're terrorists. And if you ask Muslims, then you often hear, Jews are all rich, they're pulling the strings between everything that happens behind everything that happens in the world. And that's actually something that's confirmed by many different studies. About 60% of Muslims are convinced that Jews have too much power in the international financial system. Around 40%, essentially, behind everything that's bad in the world, conflicts, wars, essentially think that Jews are behind all of that. And yeah, on the other hand, it doesn't look much better. So when you look at surveys amongst Jews, half of Jews are scared of Muslims. More than a third would say that they don't want Muslims as neighbors. And around 2/3 see Muslims as threatening and scary. I mean, those are numbers that like definitely is something that we also see in our everyday experiences. And yeah, we don't just need to talk about studies. We didn't just promise that we would talk about ourselves. We also like to do that. That's definitely something that also that's also visible in our own families. Of course, you can imagine when we said that we had found each other and had plans together, our families definitely were not very excited. There definitely was not a lot of excitement, but rather lots of deep breaths and many concerns. Yeah, so I still remember that when I visited my family in Israel, and I told them, and it was like this thick cloud over my entire visit. It was like a taboo topic. Nobody directly mentioned it. But one evening before I returned to Germany, I talked to my parents about this, or my parents and I talked about it. And my parents just said, well, what would your grandfathers have thought at the time? They had already died. And actually, one of my maternal grandfather had a strong aversion to Muslims and Arabs. And my mom said, oh, he would have turned 10 times in his grave if he had known what you're doing right now. But it was a bit different with my paternal grandfather. He was someone who got along with everyone. He had lots of Muslim and Arab friends. And probably the fact that Saba is Muslim, that wouldn't have been a big issue for him. But that she's German, he definitely would not have been able to accept that. Because he had this. I remember when I was young, he used to say, "You're supposed to love everyone," and then there was a brief break, except the Germans. Of course, that has something to do with his own biography. He fled through the entirety of Europe during the Nazi era. On the one hand, a large part of his family died, but in the end, as a British soldier, he was able to free his own father from the concentration camp Buchenwald. So he has like this very own biography, and so Saba is someone who is both Muslim and German. That's kind of a large that's a huge provocation for, at least in my family. Yeah, and in my family, there were also lots of confused follow-up questions. Many of them thought that it was maybe like a short-term thing or just a fluke, a joke, a practical joke. And then you also hear from people you are friends with how some certain images of Jews, how widespread those views are. So, for example, a friend of my mom gave her a call and said, okay, look at it from the bright side. At least your daughter will never have financial issues. My parents still didn't know at the time, and I think it's still a bit difficult, what it meant for them to grow up in a kibbutz and what that means for your relationship to material possessions. But yeah, she's also slowly learning.
So a few years passed and a lot happened, especially related to our families. And my parents visited us in Frankfurt a few times. The parents of Saba went to the kibbutz of my parents, and they get closer. And especially after the child came into the world, it was a little kitsch, but with the parents of Saba, if you go there in their flat in the living room, you can find an oil painting from the desert of Israel. My father painted this. He's a hobby painter, and my mother calls parents from time to time and asks how are the grandchildren, and if she has a recipe for Pakistani food. Within our families, it works very well. And you can see it almost as utopia or kitsch. But if we zoom out a little and dare to look at the relations between Jews and Muslims in the last months, in the last years, then the large elephant in the room has become so big that it can't be left out, and that is the conflict in the Middle East, and especially since the October 7th, 2023, it stands in a very, very different way, a prominent way. It became very clear where the conflict line between Muslims and Jews exists. And we have, in the first few weeks, we sat October, November, but even now, we sit and compare our timelines in social media, then we see there's two existing realities that exist at the same time, and they have where nobody communicates with each other. with Meron, for example, to, exaggerate this a little, the most videos that are shown are like from Israeli hostages and families with the hashtag #FreedomNow that talk about this, and with me, the pictures from Gaza are predominant. The children with bombed out houses, you can imagine these, you can know these pictures, and it's really crass to see that is a reality that exists and affects people and threatens people, and leads to the there's no empathy between the two sides, and there's a divisive rift. And with us as a Jewish-Muslim, Israeli-Muslim couple, after October 7th, we were suddenly a symbol for peace and coexistence and hope. And we always say our marriage is not a peace project, and our marriage is not a interreligious project, except for our kids maybe, but we talked about that. And not long ago at a talk, we a guest in the audience said the conflict would be gone if every Israelis would marry a Palestinian. So first of all, I'm not a Palestinian. You can find this cute, but and I understand where this despair comes from, but that there only bad perspectives for future, then that leads to projection on couples like us and other contexts. And some of us ask us so things like, will your marriage survive this conflict? And someone says, oh, I'm really sorry, you can't say what your real opinion is. And your real opinion, implying that my real opinion is that I'm somehow a supporter of Hamas. And our opinion is that we want to overcome this logic of separate opposing sides. We want to support those who want to fight for a just future for Israelis and Palestinians. Our motto is from the river to the sea, only peace will set us free. These are words of a friend of us who grew up in Gaza, Ahmed, who always brings this together. I want that my religion isn't set associated with fanaticism. I want a pro-Palestinian movement that doesn't celebrate Hamas as a liberation movement, but as an Islamist terror group that the legitimate and right demands of the Palestinian population do not justify the massacre of October 7, and the legitimate right of Israel does not justify war crimes. The 7th of October was a rift in our the great desperation that accompanies us until today. I can remember until today on this Saturday we watched TV together and we were shocked. We have our best friends in Israel. We couldn't reach them, and we heard afterwards that they didn't survive, and then we watched on TV where the commentator on TV says is celebrating and congratulates Hamas on this great success. And then we watch Israeli TV and see where the humanitarian catastrophe isn't shown at all, and ask us, how can we manage to get our communities, how can our communities ignore the other perspective and always see in another, trying to show another perspective. And as a feedback we get, we get this traitor. We hear that we're traitors. You go to the side of your people. You can't, and we're against this. We refuse to have this position. We refuse to be just in one camp. And as real Israeli German, of course I'm against Hamas. I'm suffering together with the Israeli hostages who are still in the tunnels of Hamas. But when I see the children starving in Gaza, that deliberately every aid shipment is stopped, then that 80% of Gaza is flattened, I can't accept this either, no matter which nationality and government I have, and that you also have to say this. And when it's not all our topic and not of our talk, but even if I would like to ask our government, because we're also Germans, stop the weapons shipments to Israel immediately. And without any doubt, before the end of this war. If you want to stand on the side with Israel, that also means standing with hundreds of thousands of Israelis, my family, my friends, and many, many others who go to the street and against this right-wing government and who demonstrated. They also ask for the release of the hostage. They ask for the end of the war, but this government cannot have a but and an maybe, but not. They can't be on the side of war criminals like Netanyahu and his government. And if I can also say, if Netanyahu were invited and allowed into Germany, then please don't forget to arrest him. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a talk with us, a conversation with us, Dominic. Without share. Okay, thank you very much for this talk. It's very really interesting, inspiring. When I read the text based on your talk, I was very moved, because it reminded me of a letter that my mother sent a few years ago, where she wanted to tell me how our society works, and she wanted to tell me how it is to live with two different nationalities. And in the next 30 minutes, I want to talk to you about a little deeper. And then I want to open up the round for questions from the audience as well. But first, as a start, generation X, Y, Z, what do you think, which role does or challenges or tasks does the Lange generation have, especially in relation to the conflict in the Middle East, where we need we need to know how they are, and we need to know that the polarization regarding this topic, it's important that we understand what faces them. And we only quickly talked about social media in terms of our timelines, but the daily role of social media and what it does with political positions, you cannot underestimate. And we ask ourselves, well, okay, how do young people relate to social media? And you can't really sort of set this apart anymore. First studies from last months have shown that the conflict in the Middle East, that it's a very damaging role of social media, and the information about the conflict, there's a lot of fake news, less disinformation. It's really hard to find real information, proper information, and the correction of wrong information isn't shown in these channels. And the talk in this room before that also showed this and made it easy to understand how this polarization works. And there are influencers who polarize, and in the conflict in the Middle East, it becomes very evident that there's two realities, and the selective empathy is a practice. I only look at what happens in Gaza, and I only look what happens with Israel and Jews and Jewish people in Israel, and there's no disinterest, but it's not shown to me because social media works the way they do. How can the debate in the Middle East can be done in a better way? Well, I think that the way the debate is led is completely remote, completely detached from the situation on in the region. People and friends we work together with, and of which we thought we had the same sort of vibes, even though we weren't in the same, we didn't have the same opinion all the time. Suddenly started celebrating this massacre, and ex-friend, they're not nice pictures, but how did you think that anti-colonial fight would look like? And these Islamist terrorists are suddenly framed as freedom fighters, and in the same light, I see that people who I thought were, responsible, reasonable, who suddenly support the right-wing radical government, who are very often openly committing war crimes and work for the security of the Jewish people, and think that they do that. And you have to lead that debate, and not only confirm your own feeling of well-being, and you can't just say, oh, I'm on the right side of this and everybody else is wrong. You can ask, what do these people need in the region? How can peace-seeking Israelis be supported? How can peace-seeking Palestinians be supported? And how can we support them? Every time we go to Israel, we go to a good friend and go to a kindergarten where Israelis and Palestinians are taught together and brought up together. And we go there and we gave them a little English lessons or play with the kids, and we see what do these kids need to be friends together. And even though it's maybe sound naive, but this is a start. And to not say these are the good ones, these are the bad ones. I want to applaud. I want to just applaud for my team because they have a bad team, but a bad game. But I don't think that's the way the conflict in the Middle East works.
So, what does solidarity mean for the two of you, especially with regards to the conflict in the Middle East? And what would you wish for, where do you want more? Well, I think we've tried to emphasize that we are against this thinking in camps, and that we really want to try to make the other perspective tangible and really try to be a voice for people who are often just not seen. Meron already mentioned the school. I think that's something that's here. There's a huge lack of knowledge regarding what people are doing who work towards coexistence there. Not everyone has a website or a social media account, but there's lots of people who just aren't seen here, and I think that's a perspective, or that would be a perspective. We're still trying to figure out how to implement that in a concrete way. We really hope that we would really wish there to be more conversations about, look, here's this group that's doing this, here's this school that's doing this type of stuff. Sometimes people are talking about that who have been there, and I think these perspectives could be an option for people to develop a position beyond this thinking of which camp do I belong to, pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. Is really the facts and the experiences of people on the ground could really help against this polarization, I think. Yeah, and I think there's solidarity with the people on the ground really requires to really look into both societies, the Palestinian and Israeli society. When there are people in Israel who are out on the streets against the government, who are fighting for peace and against this war, in Europe and sometimes even Germany, they get cancelled. They're artists that aren't invited anymore, or scientists. And at the same time, I also see that a lot of Palestinians got cancelled. Their exhibitions were cancelled, presentations, conferences, exhibitions. If you are serious about solidarity, then this boycott and counter-boycott is absolutely the wrong way of going about it. We have to think about how do we support these forces in both societies, and they exist in Gaza and the West Bank. Obviously, it's difficult because there's no democracy. In Israel, there are people who are still fighting for this democracy, but especially these forces, inviting them, giving them a voice, that's the right thing, not this kind of boycott that we keep experiencing and keep seeing from all sides since October 7th. So I'd like to open the stage for questions from the audience. Over there, I see one. Hi, my name is Fatima. I have to read this because I don't want to make a mistake. Thanks for telling your story so openly. That's really not that common, and I hope and wish you all the best for the future. This is so beautiful. My question: since October 7th, both anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism have significantly increased. I imagine it must be incredibly difficult. At home, how do you live that? Like to live that at home, where you're very open with these topics, but then when you go out into society and you see so much hate against both of these religious communities, and your children might not understand that at all because they know you and they know their grandparents. How do you deal with that? How can you explain to your children? Yeah, well, there's hate against us, but what? You said you emphasize the end, but how? Yeah. Well, I mean, that requires us to look into our crystal ball because it's a question about what might happen, and we might be everything but definitely not perfect in what we're doing. Obviously, we try. Okay, maybe to put it differently, there are many different ways of going about this. Also, for example, regarding religion during everyday life. For example, even in my everyday life, I am much more religious than Miron could be or wants to be. So Miron grew up as a secular Jew, and for me, religion is quite relevant for everyday life. So how do we practice that? I think that's very difficult to imagine. It's not like there's an exact 50-50 division. We just try to develop a everyday normality that children get to know, knowing, of course, that this is not something that exists out in the world as much. Although maybe in some niches, that's a huge question for me as well, how they will encounter that. I actually do research right now, and as part of this research, I did debates among children about anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism, where I tried to look at whether children at the kindergarten age already have these stereotypes, and the answer is, of course, they do. Our children are still very young; they're 1 and 3. But this question of how to deal with that, I mean, I can't give you a recipe for what our plan is. It's just reality, and we'll figure it out over time, and we'll keep learning. Is there an exchange about this question between your families? For example, with your grandparents, how do you talk about that? So my parents still live in Israel. So there's only limited contact. It's not very, very regular. But Saba's mother is really worried, especially with regards to anti-Muslim racism. The day before yesterday, Saba participated in a longer conversation on Al Jazeera, and there were a lot of hate messages. And her mom read all the comments and was really worried. So we try maybe something that's helpful. All of this, even if many of these reactions are not beautiful, but there are also often many supportive, empowering, positive reactions. We get those as well. You should never forget that. But also, we have to keep remembering that we're honestly doing pretty well. We're very privileged. For example, when we speak about Gaza or the West Bank, we are talking about people who are in genuine danger to their life, and so maybe we got an unpleasant email, but that is something you can deal with, I guess. I see another question over there from the audience. Hi, my name is Maria. I have a very specific, concrete question. I read your book as well, also your book talking about Israel. And the question is, do you believe also in the context of education, school, where there was a lot of distance learning due to COVID and other crises, that we can kind of bend the curve or kind of turn, go away from the trend that we're in right now, also with the far-right AfD gaining support, but especially when it comes to teenagers and young people who are radicalizing even further, and who also might be growing up in lived realities that are different from yours. I mean, for you and also for me, it's completely normal to treat a woman who wears a hijab, to treat her exactly the same way as a woman who might not be wearing a hijab. But especially when it comes to the problem that this many young people are celebrating the far-right AfD, is there still room to save this and kind of do something in education, or have we just lost that battle? Because I feel like we just don't have that space to have these discussions anymore. So it's less a question of asking for a recipe as parents, but I also have so much respect for the two of you, how you educate people about this, and would be curious with how you think about that, considering also the reactions you get and the experience you have. Thank you so much. I mean, I have a bad news for you. It's not just the AfD. We experience that. There's currently a very one-dimensional view, both with regards to the Middle East, conflict in the Middle East, and Muslims, Jews. And I'm not telling you anything new if I tell you that that's very closely related with social media. We also had conversations with history teachers, political science teachers, and they said, we have this plan, we want to talk about the conflict in the Middle East, we want to educate our students about that. And after 3 minutes, one student gets up and says, no, that's incorrect, I saw something different on TikTok, and then the whole thing explodes, and because all the other students are like, yeah, I also saw that, and they're and it went viral. And so the history of the Middle East is explained very well, and quote unquote, in 1.5 minutes. And what can a teacher do against that? If like all these content creators and influencers are explaining these things so simply, in a way that like fits their views, of obviously often very one-sided. Yeah, that's a huge task. And we are collaborating with many teachers to figure out how do we deal with that. How can you present different narratives as like having equal value with like different perspectives? It's also about taking into account the situation or the point of view of societal minorities, of making these situations transparent. Whether it works, I don't know. I would lie if I said I'm optimistic. Of course, no, it's a huge task. But on the other hand, ask differently, what's the alternative? Maybe I can also add to that. I'm also kind of ambivalent about the question of children and young people, because we keep talking about like these youth studies, and like Shell just published this this study about remembrance and culture of remembrance, and there's all these numbers. And on the one hand, like 70 to 80% of young people are watching YouTube channels like Mr. Knowledge to Go. But then on the other hand, so they're interested in politics and history, right? But then on the other hand, questions that are very closely related to this culture of remembrance, like very few of them know what the Holocaust really was or what happened. And so it's sometimes I feel like it's very difficult to really understand what reality on the ground is like, because you have numbers that say one thing and numbers that say another thing. But there's like one number that is quite important, and I think is also related to the fact that social media is just very important, that the politicization is something very different for these young people, because it's staying with you on your smartphone, like it's always with you all the time, right? And obviously that can go in different directions. It can go in a far-right direction, but it can also go in the other direction, right? It can politicize people regarding anti-racism or climate. It's not that I would say that everyone's like pro-climate protection, but people all know what that is. So I think there's a lot of potential during the pandemic. It's also been 5 years. We did a lot of online workshops where suddenly we were able to reach way more people. Why did I mention that? Well, during that time there were these Black Lives Matter protests, and I realized yet again that politicization, yes, of course, school is one location there, but there are many different spaces. To say it in an abstract way, but also a call for action. So we need to like really strengthening civil society. What does it mean to fight for a democratic society? I think those are also quite questions that we need to. Those are really relevant, important questions, especially when it comes to young people, and that's something that I work on, right? And so there are many open spaces, empty spaces that we haven't filled yet. Thank you. You also have a column that you write together in the Frankfurter Daily, and you publish those columns in a new book. So Muslim-Jewish dinner. You will also be signing books at 3 p.m. at the Dussmann stall. So you can meet these two there later. And for now, thank you very much. Thank you, and thanks to everyone.